Episode 5, Part 6. So when I started doing this and getting information on the Taínos, I was told there was very little information. And with this part, it's going to be 1 hour of info that I've already gathered. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. The tip, la puntitita, abajo, es un gran animal. So I'm going to continue sharing every bit of information I could find on them because I honestly believe that people enjoyed the thought that this culture just disappeared and that there was nothing on them, that we didn't know anything about them, about their daily lives, etc. I'm here to disprove that. And again, I feel that it's important for us as a people to have this background, to have this knowledge, and for everybody from the Caribbean, because these are all our ancestors. And even if you're only 0.1% Taino lineage, that still means that someone in your past was part of this culture. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with knowing about it, reclaiming it, and being proud of where your lineage comes from. So after a long day of hunting, of cooking, pottery making, haciendo canastas de diferentes clases, after all of these activities, you're probably thirsty. So I couldn't find it specifically if it was the men or the women who made the drinks. One of them was el cacheo. So esta es la palma de donde viene el cacheo. And the tree itself is called cacheo. They would make a refreshing drink that we can see here and that we still make today, el guaro, which is very familiar to many people from Central America because it is a fermented drink, alcoholic drink made from corn. And it's still used, the term is still used all over Central America. I haven't heard it as much in the Dominican. And some might be asking, why are these words so similar? Well, remember, the Taínos were multiple different indigenous ethnicities that came over from Central and South America. And so a lot of their traditions and customs and drinks, food, etc. is actually a reflection of the mainland. They also made how or hija, depending on how you want to say it. It was a liquor based from corn or maíz. So the way they made it was that they put the maíz in a basically un recipiente or a bowl kind of agua, and they would tie it with bejucos, which I'll show you later what a bejuco is if you don't know. And they would basically put the mashed corn inside of this vessel, this bowl, and they would actually then hang it. And it was basically a type of sieve. The juice out of the corn would come through. They would collect it on the bottom, and then they would leave it to ferment. Nowadays, this drink is called chicha. So having these sweet fermented drinks will probably attract some insects. So trigger warning for anybody who doesn't like insects. Here they come. El cucuyo. It illuminates at night, and it's basically, as it says somewhere around here, it's like a flying flashlight. El comején. This is a termite. And I remember living in la casita de madera in the wooden house in DR, in the Dominican, and this crap falling all over my head all the time. And they destroy wood. El guava. This is a type of scorpion, spider.
La cacata.
El jejen. Ay, esta vainita sí pica. El jejen leaves these horrible, really, really irritating marks. La jibijoa. También en otros lugares, in other places, they call it jibijagua or bibijagua. I think in Cuba le dicen bibijagua. Ay, como esta porquería picaban. Una de estas vainitas que se te metiera en un pantalón. They're tiny. Look at this. They're tiny. They're red and they're tiny and they're just horrible. Pican más que el diablo. Déjame saber si alguna vez a ustedes le picó una jibijoa. El mimi. Fruit fly. We all know they're annoying. So you're not Dominican if you didn't see this girl picking at something in her feet while living in DR. Esta es la niña niguita. Y en lo que ella se está sacando de la patita es la nigua. Y esta es la famosa nigua. So es como un tipo de garrapata. But it would basically lay eggs inside of your feet. And it was a chore to get it out. So this could cause, obviously, pain and ulcers. So as you're scratching all these bites, guay. Era la manera en que los taínos expresaban dolor o que algo le incomodaba, so they would express pain or if they were uncomfortable using this term. Guay. So after getting bit by these insects, you might want to take something for the pain. So one of the main plants, one of the first plants that Christopher Columbus encountered while he was in his boat watching these people in their canoes just chilling, he was constantly offered these dry leaves. El tabaco, el cohibi, as the Taínos called it, was something that they used constantly, every single day. They would stuff the dry leaves in a sort of tube from a plant, and this was called cohiba, which is what is still called today, these cigars. So they would do this as a way of socializing, but it was also part of their rituals. So some of their religious rituals involved smoking a lot of this to the point where they began to hallucinate. So usually the plants were cultivated near their towns called yucayeques. We know that the tobacco is actually medicinal. It is also a narcotic, but it was used also to cleanse the body in terms of like a laxative, and it's also an anti-parasitic herb, which would help them get rid of parasites. And I love how Bartolomé de las Casas, or Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, describes how they used the tobacco. So I'm going to read it in Spanish because everything that we have of the New World, the original documents, are all in Spanish. But I will try to remember to put in a translation for everyone. So he says, tenían otra manera de hierba como propias lechugas, like long leaves, which we saw in the other picture. Y estas secaban al sol y al fuego y hacían de unas hojas de árbol secas un rollante, como se hace un mosquete de papel, y metían adentro un poco de aquella hierba. Y encendían el mosquete por un lado, por una parte, y por la otra sorbían y atraían el humo hacia adentro del pecho, lo cual les causaba un adormecimiento en las carnes y en todo el cuerpo, de manera que no sentían ni hambre ni cansancio, y estos mosquetes llamaban tabaco. So from what we can understand, tobacco was one of the most valued herbs, and that's why the first thing they would do when they would see Columbus was offer him tobacco. And apparently this was a custom. So it was a custom for them, whenever meeting anyone in Orson, you would offer something to them. In other words, a gift. And for them, the best way to do that was to offer what they readily had. And apparently they carried this, especially the men, around with them always. And I was thinking, they walked around naked. How were they carrying these things? But apparently it was very normal for them to travel with packs of tobacco tied con un bejuco. Again, it's kind of like a vine from a tree. And they would bundle the leaves up and take it with them wherever they went. Later on, the Africans would also use el tabaco in order to relieve their exhaustion. Episode 5, Part 7. So the day is ending. It's still December 5th, 1492. So depending if you were a boy or a girl, you would engage in different activities during the day. And by now, you're probably tired. So we know that the Taínos did not have a set schedule for eating. It's not like us that we have breakfast, lunch, dinner, etc. They ate when they were hungry. But we do know that they would go home to their specific boil, where up to 20 people lived. One of the biggest ones was noted to have about 20 people, so 5 to 6 generations of people. That meant that you knew who your great-great-great-grandmother was, at least. So there was a sense of identity and of belonging. So you probably had your own hamaca, where you slept. Maybe your mom would squeeze in your tao, your brother or sister, in your hamaca, because your bibi, or your mom, was taking care of el Chichi. So outside, it would look like this. Moon, or noon, was clearly visible. But sometimes when there's too much noon, you can't see Turi, the stars. The moon is very powerful and a very powerful sight in the Caribbean night. And it was very easy to see the phases of the moon. And to this day, si estás en el campo, tú ves muy claramente la fase de la luna. So they actually had a lunar calendar that would let them know when to plant certain plants. So each phase of the moon was a different plant that they planted. So they would plant yuca, maíz or corn, algodón. So sarobe was algodón or cotton. Ajes, which are sweet potatoes, batatas, and they would also plant other fruit trees. They would especially plant ajís, which was included in most of their food. This was their main spice. So this was a systemic gardening. And so they also had the farmland, they had small personal gardens as well. But their main crop was la yuca. That was their main crop, and they planted it in a certain way. So I couldn't find a better example, but this is an example of how they would plant and use the different shapes of the earth for their purposes. So we have in the flatter side over here, we see different palms, fruit trees, and then here in the middle, this is how they would plant yuca in montones. So it was like a little hill, and that made it easier to access the roots. They used a special stick called a koa to make the different indents in order to plant the seeds for their produce. So it's believed that both men and women participated in planting and harvesting. It was a big event. So they used different methods for their farming. One was barcea, which is basically planting along the floodplains of rivers. Acequia, which is basically meaning making these little canals or channels between the rows of plants in order to irrigate them. Conucos. We hear this word in the Dominican Republic. So un conuco is un huerto or a personal garden. Some of the yucayeques or the towns had a larger one nearby. They also used terraces. And this, I can imagine, was absolutely beautiful por la Cordillera Central. Eso tenía que verse espectacular. One of the last methods known was slash and burn. So as you can see, they would burn the vegetation that was present, and the actual burning would release nutrients from the plants that were present, and this would then replenish the soil. I forgot to mention this last method. It's called Cajuil. However, I couldn't really find any images, so I'm just using these. It's basically farming inside of hollows of rocks. So it's like stone pots, and they would use the hollows of rocks or the hollows, even in soil, an indent in the soil, they would plant in there as well. So they actually had such a huge variety of fruits and vegetables. And as many indigenous people of the time, they believed that the gods had helped them produce this food. So the Taino gods were named semis. And the semis It's a little complicated to explain exactly how they saw them. However, I'm just going to note in this part, talking about agriculture, that they would bury their semis or their gods in the fields in order to produce the best harvest. They would also take part of their produce and take it to the semi. And the semi would be housed in the cane, which was the cacique's home. And you knew it was the cane because the canes had these two front pillars that you see here. So they were different from the other bohíos. And it was here that they would bring in the produce because usually they had another semi, another god inside of the cacique's home who they presented the produce to. Las Casas didn't really like this. Obviously, he saw it as idolatry. However, he did say that he thought it was silly because the food would go to waste and rot. So even though he supported the indigenous people, he did have his opinion about them. So now it's December 6th, 1492. As the sun comes up and the day brightens, you get up with your family members because usually everybody got up at the same time. And I saw this a lot when I visited other indigenous communities. They would all get up at the same time. It was interesting, very, very interesting, because that isn't something that we do. But you would make your way to the nearest river to give yourself a bath. And after getting clean, it was time to paint. So they were known for their body art. And Columbus noted this on his first trip. He notes on Friday, October 12, 1492. And he says, they paint themselves black, and they are neither black nor white. Some paint themselves white, others red. Some paint their faces, others their whole body. Some around the eyes, others only on the nose. We know that they also design their bodies with tattoos. These are some symbols. However, I do encourage everybody to please do their research before doing anything like this in terms of tattooing, because we don't know exactly what these symbols meant to them. It could have been that these symbols were sacred, and it could be sacrilegious to have them on your body. So I do encourage everyone to do your research. There are Taínos that still exist. They were not wiped out, that you can probably reach out to on Facebook in terms of getting the right information before anybody does this. But Oviedo commented on this practice. And Oviedo, so Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo y Valdez, he lived on the island and he absolutely despised the indigenous people. He hated them. However, he is one of our main sources of information on them. And this is what he wrote about the tattooing. It is in Old Spanish, so it's going to sound weird. But he says, más en las pinturas que sobre sus personas se ponen, teñidas y perpetuas de color negro, para cuanto viven, rompiendo sus carnes y el cuero, juntando en sí esta maldita efigie. We know that both men and women had tattoos, and it was considered something beautiful among the community. But again, as any human society, we know that there's certain things that are not okay. So please do your research before getting any tattoos inspired by Taínos. Also practice a form of cranial deformation. This man isn't a Taino, but it's an example of how it might look like in life. Of the few skeletons that have been found, because the soil in DR is very acidic, so what it does to a decomposing body is that it makes it dust. But we have found that they did practice skull deformation. So they didn't all need to get tattoos in order to have different symbolism on their bodies. These, made out of clay or arcilla, are body stamps. So using different plants for different colors, they would dip them into the coloring, the stamps, and then they would put them on their bodies. That one up here is actually a ball, and they would roll it in the coloring and then roll it on themselves. And I don't know if you can see all the way on the top. It's an example of what it would look like on the skin. So episode 5, part 8. So episode 5 is all about the Taínos, and I'm going to be covering extensively because I am tired of hearing that there's no information, that we don't know anything. Yeah, that's all a lie. So in the last episode, well, the last part, I talked about the body stamps, and these were so cool. I was so amazed because it showed me that not everybody wanted to go through the painful process of getting a tattoo. So the women were the ones who worked with arcilla or clay, and they made all of these stamps. And so most of them have symbols of animals, and they're actually pretty small. They're not big. They're not like huge body stamps, which tells you that for them, detail was important. So we know that they used various colors. They had black, white, and red. Y usaban la vija, which we still use to color our food. So they would grind this up, mash it really well, make a paste, liquefy it a little bit to make a type of ink, and they would put their stamps in and stamped it on their bodies. La Guagua. So this they use to make like a blue-black color. It's also used to make a drink. Pedro Martí de Angleria, another person who wrote about the Taínos in that time, even though he never got to meet them, he was a gossip and he loved everything about them, so he wrote everything about them. He says about this color, he says, el fruto verde es usado para teñir de un color azul oscuro que dura, aunque se le trate de quitar con otros líquidos hasta 20 días. Oviedo, the racist who didn't like them, said the following about this. He says, they use it para pelear. In other words, this was war paint. And he said, píntense con agua, que es la fruta de un árbol de que hacen una tinta negra. I actually couldn't find what they used to make the color, the white. So, but we can assume that it had to be something, something natural that they found in their surroundings. So we know that the men were naked most of the time. They didn't carry anything on them. However, women did. The only article of clothing women would wear was la nagua. So la nagua was a piece of cloth made out of cotton, arobe, and Columbus, amongst other people, saw it in two forms. So if the girl was unmarried or didn't have a partner, because marriage wasn't what we think of it today, she would wear it like the first girl here. However, if she was with a partner, she would wear it longer, up to her knees. I read in other places that it was up to the ankles. So again, it could have been a different ethnicity that did that, because the Taínos were not just one group of people. They were a lot of different ethnicities. So Oviedo notes that the cacicas, because they were also cacicas, or women that were the leaders of their town or su yucayeque, ellos se lo ponían hasta los tobillos, which are ankles. They did something really interesting with the cotton. So obviously the men would not have this piece here, but they would wrap around bands of cotton on their arms and also on their legs. You can see it better in this picture. She has it on both upper and lower arm, and they have it here right below the knee and on their ankles. They were also known to use nose rings, and they called them caracuri. So they also used a red stone that came from seashells, or el coobo, from what Pedro Martí Angleria says. And they used it to make necklaces and other jewelry. They also wore earrings called guagua, and they were round. We still see people that use those type of earrings today. And obviously the lobe was stretched until it would accommodate the size of the disc that you wanted. We also know that they had access to quartz crystals. So they also used this to make different amulets and necklaces, different things that they wanted to enjoy. We also know that they wore headdresses, and these were made of different materials, but almost all of them had feathers. And we know that they wore feathers in their hair. They incorporated them in the different headdresses that they wore. And feathers was, it from what I've read in the descriptions that I saw, it was something that was really important to them. The types of feathers, the quantity of feathers meant something. It was a status symbol. Young girls who were not married wore a cotton band around their heads, like this girl up here. So some of the ones who served the caciques wore feathered headdresses of various sizes and colors, greens, whites, blues. So they wore these on their cacola, la cabeza, and would attach some of the feathers in their caco la muya, en el pelo, in their hair. I like this image because it represents more accurately what a Taino cacique would have looked like. And this is up close. Here's the Guagua. We have these outer beads. And I know he looks very thin, but remember, they're not lifting weights. they're lean people. And this is how men would wear their belts. Many of the jewelry that they wore were made of guanin. So this was an alloy of the mix between gold and copper, and the caciques, the chiefs and the caciques, would wear them usually in half moon or in disc shapes. So that lets us know that they knew some metalwork. They would have had to have some familiarity with heating up the metal, shaping the metal, and detailing the metal. From what I understand, only the caciques and caciques were permitted to use guanin as part of their jewelry. However, I did see that when Colón met some indigenous people, he noted immediately that they had gold pieces because that's what he was after. It was just gold. So was there gold on the island? Yes, and there's still gold. Caona, which means gold in Taino, was simply found in the rivers. They would go and take it out of the rivers. They did not mine the gold. And this was a problem later on that I'll get into when we get there. But the Taínos had their own, I'm going to say, religious ceremony before going to get gold. So even for the Taínos, caona, or gold, was very important, and it seemed to be sacred, because they would actually diet or ayunaban. They wouldn't eat for a certain amount of time before going to get the gold. They would also not have sex for at least 20 days before going to find gold. Cristóbal Colón found out that in El Cibao, because that's also a Taino word, había oro. He also learned about the ceremonies that the indigenous people did before going to get the gold. Because the Taínos said that when they were with their women before getting gold, they wouldn't find any. So Columbus followed suit and made all the men do a small religious ceremony. And it consisted of going to the church and confessing their sins. He also wanted them to abstain from food. And you know what these dudes said? They said in terms of women, we're already thousands of miles away from our European women. Y dice Oviedo about the following, that supposedly these men said: En cuanto al ayunar, que muchos de los cristianos se morían de hambre, y comían raíces y otros malos manjares, y bebían agua, y se morían. However, Colón said it wasn't optional. They couldn't get around this. So they had to go to the church, confess themselves, diet, hacer ayuna, and then after that, with the word of the father of the church, go to Columbus, get a license, and after they had the license, they could go find some gold. And if they didn't get the license, they were punished very severely by Colón himself. Hi everybody. So this is still episode 5, part 9. So as a reminder to everybody new, I am doing this series because I feel that us Dominicans born and raised outside of the island, and others born on the island but raised elsewhere, whether it's Europe, USA, Asia, other countries, whatever, we have a really big disconnect with our culture and our history. And I think it's important for us to rediscover that so that we can know who we really are as a people. So this episode has been only about the Taínos, and I'm going to continue that because we have so many we can say like documentaries and all this other information about everybody else except the Taínos. So I hope you enjoy what I found. So now it's December 7th, 1492. And as Bayaku, which is Venus, you see her on the horizon, things don't feel right. Everything feels a little bit different, a little bit strange, but you don't know why. But you shrug it off and you go to your nearest river or your freshwater well to take your daily bath. You then probably gather with your family members, females or males, depending on what you are, to get some paint on. You decide that, you know what, I'm going to visit my conuco, check things out. So what are some of the plants and some of the birds that you would see? So something you might see is una ana, a flower. Or maybe you have ananas, a lot of flowers. Just wanting to interject that la rosa de Valladolid is la flor nacional de la República Dominicana. And this flower is produced on a tuna o un cactus. You know what loves Ana? El colibrí, en Taino, el guaní. Or you might see a tanamá, una mariposa. La tatagua es una mariposa that comes out at night. I have a feeling that like bats and owls, the Taínos might have associated this butterfly with the dead. You might also see a legendary bird, el intirí, or as part of the legend, Inriri Caubabayel, the carpenter bird. In Taino legend, he plays a role in forming women. In my next episode, I'll cover all about Taino legends. I loved seeing this little bird while I lived in DR. This is el jajabi, el perico. This bird, also very common, el catey. Le decimos periquito allá. And if you know these by other names, it's perfectly fine, normal. Remember that even among the Taínos, there were different ethnicities, so there's different names for the same birds. La cua, I remember seeing these a couple of times. I love the tail. A predator bird might fly by. This is one of them, la cuyaya. I personally don't remember this bird, but este es el chicuí. This one's a little difficult to say. Este era el guaycaica. Guaycaica. También conocido como el pájaro bobo. Otra ave de rapiña, in other words, a predator bird, el guaraguao. Muchos conocen el guaraguao. This beautiful little bird is el cuatiní, ave nacional de Cuba. So this little bird I remember very well. It is super territorial, and that's why the scientific name is Tyrant Dominican. Pero en Taíno se conocía como el guatibín. Y me recuerdo que allá le decían el petigre, algo así. Esta no la vi afuera, pero la vi muchas veces de mascota o as a pet. Esta es la cotorra, pero en Taíno, la iguaca. My mom don't like these. El múcaro, the owl. This little bird you would see mostly in lakes and swamps, but maybe there's a lake nearby your conuco. Esta es la tigua. And there were the ducks everywhere. So this one was called La Yaguasa. It was very common on the island. So after observing so many beautiful birds in your conuco, what else would you see? You might have a níspero tree. This tree was seen as sacred in El Cacicasco de Magua in the Yucayeque of Guarionex, one of the caciques. They would leave offerings at the base of this tree. Originally, it was called Nispola. You might have this, now called Anon, originally Mocuyo. We see these right off the airport, el guano. Del material de fibra que produce esta palma, we make hats, sombreros, macutos, y árganas. It was also used to cover the bollos. El guau. This plant was poisonous. It produces burns on the skin. It still exists today. Las Casas wrote, la leche de este árbol es ponzoñosa y de ella y de otras cosas hacen los indios la hierba que ponen en las flechas con que matan. You 100% have this one in your conuco, la cana. This one was great for making brooms y canastas or baskets. The branches where the palm fruit is holding on to was called tiriguillo. What a colorful sight on this. Las Casas said que la fruta del mamey era buenísima. It was so good. And growing up, for me, el color naranja or orange was color mamey. El jobo. It was a sacred tree. According to Fray Ramon Panel, the Taínos told him that the jobo trees were actually people converted into trees by the sun. For the Taínos, this beautiful yellow fruit represented the sun as well. El árbol, la javilla, it comes in two variations with and without thorns. La imocona. Similar to la yautía, Oviedo said, la cual asada sabe a yuca de la tierra firme, which is the yuca that they brought over later on, o la que llaman boniata, que no mata, y es sana fruta. Originally icaco, now we call it jicaco, and its fruit is medicina. We now know this as el higuero, but originally the name of this tree was guira. Y la fruta es la higuera. After seeing all these plants and birds and etc., you might be hungry and head to la playa. You might find these before you even get there. La agua de playa, which they called guayabara. El buen pan también andaba por el camino. It was originally called guapén. And maybe you decide, you know what, I want to do some fishing. You would maybe grab some of these. These were used in the rivers to knock out the fish. It was called guanibre. But you had to be careful. Too much of this could poison the water. As you walk, you might catch a glimpse of this man over here. El guanabá. My mom remembers playing with these. They were used as marbles or canicas. El callaubo or el callajabo, depending on who you ask. And you probably have the most beautiful tree in the world, la caoba, or the mahogany tree. Look at that wood, beautiful. Another image of the full tree. This one was located in the higher elevations, pero es el pino, que nosotros conocemos como el Guagua. Y de este árbol sacamos el famoso jabón dominicano, el jabón de Guagua. You might spot a ciguamo o una quiebracha. Y no puede faltar el bijao o la hoja del plátano cimarrón. I think el caguayo just ran by your feet. Next one is a snake, so trigger warning. I saw plenty of these, el jujo. Y no te dejes agarrar por el yacare. So episode 5, part 10. So again, for those just following, I'm doing this for all of us Dominicans who have been raised outside of the island and need to reconnect with our history and our culture. So it's still December 7th, 1492. You've been having a great time at your conuco, seeing all of the fruit trees, the birds, everything around you, even though things feel a little weird. But then you hear this. This sound lets you know that it was time to get home, back to your yucayeque, because it was time for an areito. So an areito was a ceremonial dance, or in Taino, diumba. Supposedly another word was also changui, from what the cronistas or the chroniclers, which includes Parné, Bartolomé de las Casas, Oviedo, tell us about areitos. It meant to remember. It was their way of preserving the past. This was their history book. Oviedo describes it in this way. He says, y en esta isla, a lo que he podido entender, solo sus cantares, que ellos llaman areitos, es su libro o memorial que de gente en gente queda, de los padres a los hijos y de los presentes a los venideros, como aquí se dirá. He continues saying the following. Tenían estas gentes una buena y gentil manera de memorar las cosas pasadas y antiguas. Y esto era en sus cantares y bailes, que ellos llaman areíto, entre ellos alguna notable fiesta, o sin ella por su pasatiempo. Juntábanse muchos indios e indias, algunas veces los hombres solamente, y otras veces las mujeres por sí o solas, y en las fiestas generales, así como por una victoria, un vencimiento de los enemigos, o casándose el cacique o rey de la provincia, o por otro caso en que el placer fuese comúnmente de todos, para que hombres y mujeres se mezclasen. Y por más extender su regocijo, se tomaban de las manos, o algunas veces se trabábanse brazo con brazo insertado, as we see here. They have their arms intertwined with each other. Ha sido muchos enrengle. So rengle was like in order, like they have here male, female, male, female. Uno de ellos tomaba el oficio de guiar, ora fuese hombre o mujer. So I assume in this depiction that this girl here is the one who's the leader of the areito. He continues describing it and says, aquel daba ciertos pasos adelante y hacia atrás, a manera de un contrapás muy ordenado. Lo mismo y en el instante hacían todos los demás. Y así andan en torno, cantando en aquel tono alto o bajo que la guía les entonaba. And he describes the rhythm that they would take. He said, y como lo hace, dice, muy medida, concertada la cuenta de los pasos con los versos, o palabras que encantan. In other words, they went with the rhythm of the lyrics. And then Oviedo describes it coming all together. He says, y así como aquel dice, so whatever she was saying, la multitud de todos responde con las mismas palabras y en la misma orden de pasos. And he says that while everybody else is repeating, she's still pacing. So en tanto que le responden, la guía calla, aunque no lo cesa de andar al contrapás. So she keeps dancing though, going back and forth. So he finalizes and says, y acabada la respuesta, que es repetir o decir lo mismo que el guiador dijo, procede incontinente, mínimo ending, sin intervalo, no pausing, la guía a otro verso en palabras que el coro, which is everybody else, todos tornan a repetir. Y así sin cesar, les dura estos 3 o 4 horas o más hasta que el maestro o el guiador de la danza acababa su historia. He says, a veces duraban hasta el otro día cantando con aquel mal instrumento, because he didn't like the sounds of the instruments, o sin él en su cantar, En estos cantares relatan de la manera que murieron los caciques pasados y cuántos y cuáles fueron otras cosas que ellos quieren que no se olviden. And he made an interesting comparison with their dance with Spanish dances. He said, algunas veces se remudan aquellas guías o maestros de la danza y mudando el tono y el contrapaso, they would change the tone and the pace, prosiguen en la misma historia o otra, o dice otra, si la primera se acabó, en el mismo son o en el mismo tono que la otra. Esta manera de baile parece algo a los cantares y danzas de las labradores cuando en algunas partes de España en verano con los panderos, hombres y mujeres se solacen. Y en Flandes, esto lo mismo, la misma forma de cantar, bailando hombres y mujeres en muchos coros. He continues explaining. I think this is important because this was so much part of their culture, and it's important for us to understand why they did it. So he says that por esta forma recitan las genealogías, so the genealogy, de sus caciques y reyes o señores que han tenido, y las obras que hicieron, y los malos o buenos temporales que han pasado o tienen, y otras cosas que ellos quieren que a chicos y grandes se comuniquen y sean muy sabidos o sabidas y fijamente esculpidas en la memoria. And he even gives the reason why, even when he saw it, he personally saw the areitos, Oviedo, the racist guy who didn't like them. He saw the areitos, he says, in 1515 or 1515. This was almost 20 years after Columbus arrived. And he says, y por este efecto continúan estos areitos porque no se olvidan. En especial las famosas victorias por batallas, los de esta isla, cuando yo los vi en el año de 1515. So did everybody in El Ucayeque participate in this part of the areito? No, not everybody did. Some of them would be in the Guateque. I couldn't really find a good picture of this, but this was the center of the areito, but around them would be other people. So these people that were around el areito would actually go around to the people participating and would give them to drink so that they didn't have to stop dancing. And Oviedo described what this drink was. He says, y esto que beben son ciertos brebajes que entre ellos se usan y quedan. Acabada la fiesta, los más de ellos y de ellas embriagados. Es sin sentido, tendidos por la tierra por muchas horas. So how did the areito end? Oviedo also explains. Y así como alguno cae beodo, or out of his mind, le apartan de la danza y prosiguen los demás, de forma que la misma borrachera es la que da conclusión al areito. He explained that this was not in every areito. It was only in weddings, deaths, or for battle. Or in a victory as well. Because he says that they made a lot of areitos, but they didn't get drunk like that. And he says everybody knew how to participate in the areito because some of them just like to get drunk. Others enjoyed the music. And he says that sometimes new songs would show up because somebody had a great ability to design those lyrics. O como dice el mejor ingenio en tal facultad.